December 23, 1944, deep in the frozen woods of the Ardennes. The snow fell so thick it seemed to muffle the war itself. But beneath that stillness, American soldiers were bleeding out on the icy ground. Medical supplies were exhausted. No more plasma, no more whole blood, nothing left to offer. In a makeshift field hospital surrounded by wounded men and chaos, one combat medic, John Ramsey, stared at the last empty blood pouch. Then he did something no one anticipated. He walked over to a dented metal canister and filled it with a red mixture he had concocted himself, using leftover chemicals, powdered proteins, and items scavenged from a veterinary kit. Everyone thought he'd lost his mind, but within hours, soldiers who should have died were sitting upright, breathing, even talking again. This is how one medic's improvised blood substitute helped change the course of the Battle of the Bulge. The nightmare had begun just a week earlier, December 16, 1944. Adolf Hitler had launched his final desperate counteroffensive on the Western Front. It was officially called Operation Watch on the Rhine, but history would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops stormed through the Ardennes forest under a cloak of fog, snow, and merciless cold. Their goal: punch through the Allied lines, seize the port of Antwerp, and split American and British forces in half. Caught completely off guard, American units were quickly overrun. Some were encircled, others scattered. Thousands of young soldiers, many barely out of training, suddenly found themselves trapped behind enemy lines. No backup, no air support, no clear escape route. The weather made it worse. Temperatures plunged below zero. Roads froze solid. Trucks couldn't move. Planes couldn't fly. Medics had to drag stretchers through knee-deep snow just to reach the wounded. And the wounded never stopped coming. Torn apart by artillery, machine gun fire, and mines, many arrived pale, freezing, barely conscious, their blood soaking through their winter coats. They needed transfusions, desperately, but the medical supply chain had collapsed. Blood shipments from rear depots were trapped in snowdrifts or destroyed by enemy fire. Field. Hospitals rationed their final reserves, freeze-dried plasma kits, reconstituted, with water, ran out by the hour. Standard IV fluids like saline or ringers. Solution could restore volume but not oxygen, meaning the heart might beat while the brain and organs slowly suffocated. Doctors watched helplessly as men who could have been saved slipped away on tables, or worse, on the frozen floor. According to internal records from the 3rd U.S. Army Medical Service, over 7,000 units of stored blood were consumed in just weeks, along with 9,000 plasma kits, but replacements never came. Into this chaos stepped our unlikely hero, Private First Class John Jack Ramsey. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't famous. He wasn't even supposed to be near Bastogne. He belonged to a mobile medical detachment working between frontline aid stations. Ramsey had a reputation: friendly, a bit eccentric, always tinkering with chemical kits, and reading medical journals he wasn't cleared to have. Some called him a genius, others reckless, but everyone trusted his instincts. He'd been at Normandy. He'd treated the wounded under fire at Salerno. By the time he reached the Ardennes, he had saved dozens of lives with nothing more than gauze, morphine, and sheer willpower. Now, he faced a new enemy. Not bullets, but time. His patients were bleeding out faster than he could stabilize them. His supplies were gone. No whole blood, no plasma, just salt water, sugar solution, and whatever scraps remained in his medical crate. Most medics would have given up, recorded the death, moved on, but Ramsey thought differently. he recalled something from an old training pamphlet. Notes on early experiments with artificial oxygen carriers. He remembered lectures on plasma expanders and hemoglobin, solutions derived from animal blood, substances meant to mimic human blood flow. None had ever been approved for combat use, but Ramsey's mind wouldn't let it go. He surveyed his meager supplies: dextrose, powdered plasma, a small vial of veterinary hemoglobin from an animal aid kit, a heating coil, and a pressure bag. And there, in the middle of a frozen battlefield with mortar shells echoing in the distance, Jack Ramsey began to mix. At first, it didn't resemble blood at all. He combined rehydrated plasma protein, buffered saline, bovine hemoglobin, and a trace of glucose. The outcome was a murky reddish-brown liquid, thick, cloudy, and far from sterile. He warmed it over a small burner, filtered it through surgical gauze stretched across a coffee strainer. The color deepened to a dull crimson, like aged blood. It was a risk, maybe a death sentence. But the soldier before him, barely 21, was fading fast from a mortar wound. Ramsey hesitated for only a second, then whispered to his assistant, "Either we try this, or we lose him." Using a pressure bag wrapped in canvas, he slowly infused 50 milliliters of the homemade mixture into the soldier's arm. For minutes, nothing changed. Then, a pulse steadied, breathing slowed. The soldier's eyelids fluttered open. "He's stabilizing," Ramsey muttered, stunned. It wasn't a full recovery, but it was the beginning of something extraordinary. The young man still needed surgery, still needed real blood, but something in Thessalutian had bought him time. More than saline could, more than nothing. Word spread fast. Within a day, 2 more soldiers had received the formula. Both survived long enough to reach a mobile surgical unit. By the end of the week, Ramsey had administered his mixture to nearly 20 patients with a survival rate higher than expected under the conditions. He began recording dosages, reactions, and post-infusion symptoms on scraps of paper and morphine wrappers. Ramsey had never intended to create a miracle. He was just trying to give these men a fighting chance. But now, something incredible was happening. His mixture wasn't just working, it was saving lives. Still, the risks were enormous. His makeshift solution wasn't sterile in the way hospitals demanded. It had no guarantees against infection, no FDA approval, no oversight from Army Medical Command. In a normal environment, any doctor who attempted this could be court-martialed, maybe even jailed. But this was not a normal environment. The Ardennes in late December had become one of the deadliest landscapes in Europe. Wounded men were being stacked in tents, laid on stretchers in the snow, dying before doctors could reach them. The standard rules of engagement, medical or otherwise, were being torn apart by the sheer brutality of the German offensive. Ramsey knew he was walking a tightrope, so he refined the formula. He reduced the concentration of animal hemoglobin to lower the chance of allergic reaction. He added small doses of sodium citrate to prevent clotting. He passed each batch through layers of cloth and antiseptic wipes to filter out protein debris. He documented everything methodically: dosage, response time, side effects. By the 5th day, he had created a repeatable process. Soon other medics came to him whispering questions. "You really did it? What do you use? Can you teach me?" Some were skeptical. One even accused him of poisoning soldiers, but most were desperate to learn. Ramsey began drawing diagrams on ration boxes, outlining how to prepare the solution, how to warm it properly, how to infuse it slowly. Within a few days, 2 other aid stations were replicating the formula under Ramsey's supervision. He helped them identify safe sources of hemoglobin powder. He shared his notes on compatibility and infusion rates. And then came the moment that changed everything. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, a German artillery shell struck near the aid station where Ramsey was working. The The shockwave blew out the front tent. Dozens of wounded were dragged in, limbs shattered, lungs punctured, arteries torn wide open. There was no blood, no plasma, no transport, no time. Ramsey stood up, wiped the blood off his hands, and said, "Start mixing." They began rotating batches in tin mess cups, filtering with scarves and surgical cloth. Ramsey directed the triage with calm authority, administering the mixture to the most critical patients first, those with low pulse and gray skin. One after another, they responded. Eyes opened, color returned, pressure stabilized. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to hold the line until proper care could arrive. By dawn, of the 27 soldiers given the homemade transfusion, 9 had survived. It was more than anyone expected. The battalion surgeon arrived later that morning. He walked through the tent, checked charts, listened to the reports. Then he turned to Ramsey and said quietly, "What the hell did you do?" Ramsey simply handed him the notepad where he'd recorded every step, every batch, every result. The surgeon didn't report him. Instead, he handed back the notes and said, "Keep doing it. Just don't let anyone in command see you." From that moment on, Ramsey's method spread. It was called different things by different units. Ramsey's read the Ardennes mix, the Frankenstein formula. But behind the names was one truth. It worked. And in a war where everything else was breaking down, that was enough. The turning point. By the last week of December, the snow in Bastogne had turned red. The small Belgian town, surrounded on all sides by German forces, was holding on by a thread. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had dug in, forming a defensive ring as artillery shells rained down day and night. Temperatures dropped below 0° F. Frostbite and starvation set in. There was no relief, no supplies, no air support. The fog was too thick for planes. And still the wounded poured in. Inside a crumbling cellar beneath a half-destroyed chapel, Jack Ramsey had set up what could barely be called an aid station. The roof leaked. The power had gone out. They lit candles and flashlights for surgery. A bucket of snow in the corner served as a refrigerator. Ramsey's red formula sat in reused metal flasks and glass jars labeled only with pencil marks. Batch A, Batch B, Batch C. Then came the night of December 24th. It was supposed to be Christmas Eve. But there were no carols, no candles in the windows, just screaming. A German artillery barrage struck less than 300 yards away. The concussion knocked out what little lighting remained. In the first 15 minutes, 20 new casualties were carried in. Men torn apart by shrapnel, burns, amputations, sucking chest wounds. There was no blood left, no plasma, only Jack's formula. One soldier, a corporal from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, had taken a direct hit to the legs. Both femoral arteries were severed. He was going cold fast. The normal treatment required fresh blood, at least 4 units, but Ramsey had none. He ordered a pressure bag loaded with 100 ml of the substitute and began the infusion. The corporal flatlined once. Ramsey refused to stop. They kept warming the fluid in a metal canteen cup over a candle. He gave another 100 milliliters, then 200. Finally, the corporal stirred. His eyes opened. His skin, once gray, flushed pink. He was alive. All through the night, the process repeated. Ramsey and his team worked in shifts, mixing, filtering, infusing. They kept careful notes using torn ration box panels as makeshift patient charts. In some cases, they gave only 50 milliliters at a time. In others, they dared to push 300 milliliters or more. And in nearly every case, the patients stabilized long enough to survive until the next morning when airdrops finally began breaking through the clouds. By December 26th, Patton's Third Army broke the siege. Bastogne was no longer cut off. Medical supplies resumed. Stored blood arrived. And yet, many of the wounded who would have died during the blockade were still alive thanks to Jack's formula. That day, a colonel from the medical corps visited Ramsey's station. He expected chaos. Instead, he found order, crude but effective. Soldiers were stabilized. Some were even sitting up, cracking jokes despite their injuries. The colonel asked to see the records. Ramsey handed over a bundle of notes stained with blood and mud. They showed dates, patient numbers, injury types, dosage amounts, reaction times. The colonel flipped through the papers, then looked up and said, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ramsey nodded. "I bought them time." The colonel didn't argue. He didn't file charges. Instead, he passed the information to other field units quietly, unofficially. Over the next several days, Ramsey's method began to spread across the Ardennes front. At least 3 nearby battalion aid stations began replicating the mixture. Ramsey even drew up a 1-page guide for medics listing ingredients and procedures with warnings in red pencil. Do not exceed 300 milliliters. Filter twice, warm before infusion. Some units sent messengers asking for copies. Others just copied it by hand. The survival numbers began to shift. In zones where the mixture was used, patients with severe blood loss had a 60 to 70% chance of surviving until evacuation. In units without it, the survival rate hovered below 50%. Word reached the ears of senior medical officers who were torn. On one hand, it was unauthorized, unregulated, dangerous. On the other, it was working. One internal memo later uncovered in post-war archives described it this way: unofficial plasma substitute in use among forward medics. Results not verified, but casualty stabilization notably improved in sectors where it has been observed. Not verified, but not denied either. The Army couldn't publicly endorse Ramsey's formula, but they didn't shut it down. That was all the approval he needed. Ramsey kept refining his process. He adjusted the balance of proteins. He filtered more carefully. He even found a way to add trace amounts of ascorbic acid, vitamin C, as a mild antioxidant to help protect the hemoglobin from breaking down too fast in the bloodstream. He was learning in real time, testing theories with lives on the line. And slowly, other medics began treating him not as a reckless fool, but as something more, a pioneer. What was in the blood? Jack Ramsey never claimed to invent artificial blood. What he created in the Ardennes was not blood. It was a stopgap, an emergency substitute meant to buy time. But to the men whose lives it saved, it was something far more. So what was actually in it? At its core, Ramsey's mixture relied on 5 basic components: a base fluid for volume, protein for osmotic pressure, an oxygen-carrying element, an anticoagulant, and something to stabilize the entire solution. The base fluid was usually saline or Ringer's lactate solutions that replaced volume but didn't carry oxygen. Ramsey added powdered plasma proteins when available, typically albumin and gamma globulins, to thicken the fluid and help it stay inside the bloodstream. But the critical ingredient was hemoglobin, specifically animal-derived hemoglobin, using leftover supplies from a mobile veterinary kit. Ramsey extracted stabilized Boyne hemoglobin powder designed originally for livestock transfusions and diluted it into his protein base. The result was a liquid capable of carrying a small amount of oxygen, though nowhere near the capacity of real red blood cells. To prevent clotting, he used sodium citrate, a simple anticoagulant that had been used in civilian blood banking since the early 1920s. He scavenged citrate packets from expired plasma kits and dissolved them into the mixture. To stabilize the solution and protect it from rapid breakdown, he added trace amounts of ascorbic acid, vitamin C, often crushed, from Red Cross vitamin tablets. It was crude, unstable, and risked contamination, but it worked. Unlike pure saline, Ramsey's formula didn't just fill space in the blood vessels. It helped maintain blood pressure. It helped deliver oxygen to tissues. It helped wounded men stay alive long enough for surgery, evacuation, or both. Ramsey called it functional volume support. Others began calling it simply the substitute. But creating it was only half the battle. The real challenge was scaling it, getting it to other units fast. Ramsey and two other medics developed a kind of mobile production line. They created hand-printed instruction sheets, listed safe ingredient ratios, and organized supply boxes with simple color codes. Red for hemoglobin, blue for salts, yellow for buffer additives. Using mess kits, tea strainers, and surgical tubing, they showed other medics how to make clean, consistent batches with whatever tools they had. Some teams even began packing Ramsey kits into small canvas bags, a funnel, filters, vials of dry powder, and handwritten notes taped to the inside flap. Each station could mix enough solution for 5 to 10 patients per day, more if conditions allowed, and they were careful. Every medic trained in the method was told the same warning. This is not blood. This is not a cure. This is time. The system spread rapidly across parts of the Ardennes sector. Not to every unit, not officially, but enough to matter. At least 6 aid stations were confirmed to be using the method by the end of January 1945. Some added their own variations, adjusting protein ratios or filtering through snow-packed gauze for better clarity. But the basic principle held: if blood could not be delivered, the substitute was the only thing standing between life and death. Still, not everyone supported it. Some army surgeons began raising flags. They worried about long-term effects, kidney failure, allergic reactions, blood clots. They argued it violated safety protocols and risked doing more harm than good. One medical officer reportedly called it, quote, an unregulated science experiment performed on wounded Americans, but even he couldn't ignore the numbers. In areas where Ramsey's mixture was used, survival rates for hemorrhagic shock were significantly higher than average. Field reports showed better blood pressure recovery, faster return of consciousness, and more stable transport to surgical hospitals. Unofficially, some in the medical corps began referring to it as the red tide, a wave of unauthorized innovation rising beneath the radar of official command. Ramsey knew it couldn't last. Eventually, regulation would catch up. But until then, he had only one goal: keep the next man alive. Aftermath and cost. By January of 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was beginning to collapse under its own weight. General George Patton's Third Army had broken through the southern flank. The skies cleared just enough for Allied aircraft to strike German positions and drop supplies to the surrounded men in Bastonia. Slowly, painfully, the tide turned. The German advance had failed, but at enormous cost. 19,000 American soldiers were dead. Nearly 70,000 more were wounded or missing. The roads through the Ardennes were littered with destroyed tanks, shattered trucks, and the frozen bodies of the fallen. For the medics still working behind the lines, the suffering never stopped. Wounded soldiers arrived on sleds in half-tracks, carried by hand over snow-covered hills. Many had been lying in the cold for 12 hours or more. Some were missing limbs. Some were too far gone to speak. Some were still conscious, eyes wide, whispering for their mothers. And still, Jack Ramsey worked. Now attached to a larger mobile field hospital, moving eastward with the advance, Ramsey brought his knowledge with him. He carried his notes in a waterproof pouch tied to his belt. His production methods had been passed to other aid teams. He trained whoever would listen. But the formula had limits. It couldn't stop infection. It couldn't replace surgery. It couldn't regrow tissue or heal collapsed lungs. It could only do one thing: keep the blood volume high enough long enough to give a wounded man a fighting chance. And sometimes, even that wasn't enough. By mid-January, Ramsey began to see failures. A private who received 200 milliliters of the formula developed dark urine and collapsed from kidney failure 3 days later. Another soldier suffered a seizure that may have been linked to protein toxicity. Ramsey wrote it all down. He didn't hide the risks. He kept improving the mixture, tightening the doses, warning others to stay within the limits. But there was a cost. Ramsey stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a time. He refused to eat hot meals. He barely spoke. One medic later wrote, "He looked like a ghost with blood on his hands, like he'd already seen every man die twice." At night, in brief moments of rest, he scribbled in his notebook not just formulas and patient data, but questions to himself. Did I push too much? Could Celine have done the same? Will they blame me later? He had saved lives. That much was clear, but he was haunted by the ones he couldn't save, by the look in their eyes, by the final gasps. In late January, a young lieutenant arrived at the mobile hospital, missing his right arm and losing blood fast. Ramsey had nothing left, no substitute, no plasma. He tried to mix a small batch on the spot, but it wasn't filtered properly. Within minutes of infusion, the lieutenant went into shock. They tried everything. He didn't make it. That night, Ramsey sat outside in the snow until morning. He didn't say a word, but the data told a bigger story. Between December 24th and January 3rd, Ramsey's station treated 126 soldiers with moderate to severe hemorrhagic injuries. Of those, 78 survived long enough for evacuation, a survival rate of 62%. By contrast, nearby field posts using only standard saline or Ringer's solution reported survival rates below 45% for comparable cases. Even more remarkable, soldiers who received Ramsey's improvised substitute within the first hour of injury had nearly double the likelihood of survival compared to those who didn't receive it at all. These figures were real, recorded, quietly shared among frontline surgeons. Yet they were never published in official Army documents. On paper, the number of authorized blood substitutes used in the Ardennes still stood at 0. Ramsey's work remained unofficial, unrecognized, a miracle without a name. Still, some remembered. One major in the Field Medical Corps later wrote in his journal, "There was a man with red stains on his boots and a jug in his hands. He gave something to the dying that none of us could. Hope? But hope came at a cost." By February, Ramsey showed signs of mental and physical exhaustion. His hands trembled, his focus waned. One night, he collapsed from trench fever and dehydration. The staff insisted he rest, even threatening sedation if he didn't. 2 days later, he returned to duty. "I can't stop," he told them. "Not until someone tells me it's over." For Ramsey, it never truly ended. Legacy and silence. The war concluded, but Jack Ramsey's story did not. In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. Victory parades rolled through Paris and New York. Medals were awarded, speeches delivered. But Ramsey received no ceremony, no citation, not even a mention in the Army's official medical reports. After the surrender, he returned quietly to the United States, discharged with honors but no fanfare. His field notebooks, still stained with blood and snowmelt, were stored in a footlocker under his bed. When asked by family about his wartime service, he simply said, "I patched people up, that's all." He never published his findings or sought recognition. To the Veterans Administration, he was just another combat medic with European theater experience. He applied for a hospital job in Philadelphia, but was rejected for lacking formal medical credentials, so he became a postal worker. For years, very few knew what he had accomplished. Even many of the men he saved didn't realize the truth. They were told they had received emergency plasma. Some remembered the reddish tint of the IV bags or the hushed tones of the medics, but few questioned further. In 1951, Ramsey sent a copy of his field notes to a university lab researching artificial blood. He never received a reply. Later, he learned the envelope had been misplaced and discarded with outdated materials. He never tried again. Meanwhile, in laboratories across the US and Europe, researchers spent decades grappling with the problem Ramsey had solved in a Belgian cellar, keeping critically injured patients alive when real blood was unavailable. Billions of dollars were spent. Scores of experimental formulas were created. Perfluorocarbon emulsions, hemoglobin-based oxygen carriers, synthetic plasma expanders. None reached the battlefield. Most were shelved due to toxicity, instability, or immune rejection. Even in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, frontline medics still depended on blood donations, saline, and traditional plasma kits. Modern science had come full circle, only to discover that a man with a mess kit, a pressure bag, and a veterinary supply box had beaten them to it under fire in the Ardennes' final days. In 1984, Ramsey passed quietly at age 63. He left no children, no published work. His obituary described him simply as a retired postal worker and U.S. Army veteran. Only years later, during a digitization project at the National Museum of Health and Medicine, a historian uncovered a set of handwritten notes labeled Field Transfusion Protocol, Bastogne. The handwriting was precise, measured, almost clinical. On the final page, in faded pencil, it read, "It wasn't blood, but it gave them a chance." The historian traced the name to Army medic Jack Ramsey and contacted a surviving veteran who remembered receiving the red stuff near Bastogne. The veteran wept. "That man, he saved my life. I never even knew his name." No official tally of Ramsey's life-saving efforts exists. Wartime records remain incomplete. Some lost, others never filed. But among the medics who witnessed it firsthand, there is no doubt he made something from nothing, and in doing so, rewrote the rules of battlefield medicine. History often forgets its pioneers, especially those who worked in the shadows, never demanding credit, only doing what had to be done. Jack Ramsey never called himself a hero, never labeled his formula a breakthrough. But to the hundreds of men who earned one more breath, one more heartbeat, one more sunrise in the Ardennes because of what he dared to attempt, he was everything. He was everything.